Well, it's week 3 of our study of the Sermon on the Mount. And we've reached the point in the Sermon on the Mount where things start to get real. Now, in weeks 1 and 2, we heard some important truth, but it was pretty much kind of broad introductory truth. But starting today, in Matthew 5, things start to get very specific. And if you'll join me in today's passage, which is Matthew 5, 21 through 37, I'll show you what I mean. By the way, you can find that on page 1474 in the Bibles under your seats. While you're finding today's passage, though, I do want to take advantage of this time to share some important life-saving information that was shared with me recently. Now, here's the thing. I don't know if you'll ever need this life-saving advice or not, but I figured I should share it just in case. Here's what the United States Peace Corps says you should do if you're ever attacked by an anaconda. 1, if an anaconda attacks you, do not run. The snake is faster than you. 2, lie flat on the ground. Put your arms tight against your sides and keep your legs tight against one another. Do not panic. 3, tuck in your chin. Do not panic. 4, the snake will come and begin to nudge and climb over your body. Do not panic. 5, after the snake has examined you, it will begin to swallow you, feet first. Always feet first. Permit the snake to swallow your feet and ankles. Do not panic. 6, the snake will now begin to suck your legs into its body. You must lie perfectly still. This will take a long time. Do not panic. 7, when the snake has reached your knees, slowly and with as little movement as possible, slide your knife into the side of the snake's mouth, between the edge of its mouth and your leg. Rip upwards, severing the snake through the top of the head. 8, be sure to have your knife with you at all times. Be sure your knife is sharp. By the way, has anyone ever seen this advice before? All right. Well, it all seems like important information to me, but it also seems like number 8 is the most important information, right? Doesn't it seem like that should be number 1 on the list? Well, here's the deal. I'm going to share some really life-giving information today, and so that we don't make the same mistake, I'm going to share the most important information first. Now, here's the deal. We're about to enter into a section where things start getting really specific in Scripture. And in fact, we're going to hear Jesus say multiple times, hey, you have heard it said, but I say to you. Here's the most important thing for you to hear. Jesus is not trying to be a meaner Moses. He's not about to say, hey, the Old Testament said do 100 push-ups. I tell you to do 200. Neither is he saying, hey, that Old Testament stuff doesn't matter anymore. You can ignore it. What Jesus is actually trying to do is to help us see the heart of God's law. But in order to see the heart of God's law, he has to clear up all sorts of misunderstanding that had been widely circulated about God's law, which is actually kind of like that anaconda advice. That information has actually been shared widely across the internet for years. I'm surprised you haven't seen it. The thing is, it actually isn't true. First of all, anacondas actually swallow their prey from the head first, always head first. Secondly, the Peace Corps doesn't actually publish anything about anaconda attacks, which means you will have to find your own way to survive should that happen. Of course, according to Jesus, we might need to find another way to apply the law. That is, a better way to apply the law that isn't rooted in misunderstanding, but actually rooted in the love of God. That in mind, I invite you to hear these words, Matthew 5, 21 to 37. Jesus said, you have heard it said, that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder. Anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body to go into hell. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, so like I said, Jesus says multiple times in Matthew 5, you've heard it said, but I say to you. And for the record, we actually just saw 4 of those statements. There are 2 more in Matthew 5 that we'll actually deal with next week. But each of these statements, again, you have heard it said has something to do with commands in the Old Testament being the Bible of Jesus' day. And the I tell you part is the attempt to clarify some maybe misunderstanding about those commands. And so that we're reminded that Jesus is clarifying, not nullifying the law, I'll remind you of something that we looked at 2 weeks ago from earlier in this chapter. In Matthew 5:17, Jesus explicitly says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets, which is shorthand for the Old Testament. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Now, the good news for us is that Jesus fulfills the law for us by way of his life, death, and resurrection. Perfect life, sacrificial death, and victorious resurrection. The law is fulfilled. But what Jesus makes clear by way of teaching, including what we see today, is that the heart of God's law still applies. Of course, in order to see the heart of God's law, he has to deal with some misunderstanding. And that's what we're going to do for today. We're going to start by looking at the misunderstanding in Jesus' day, because there's a lot going on in what we just read. But before we're done, we're actually going to clear up some misunderstanding that I think we may have today about how God's law applies to followers of Jesus. Now, the misunderstanding in Jesus' day largely has to do with groups like the Pharisees, who loomed large in the region where the Sermon on the Mount was preached. Now, the Pharisees had the best intentions in mind. We have to give them their props. They were zealous for God. They desperately wanted his kingdom to come, but they made the mistake in thinking that perfect obedience to God's law is what would usher in God's kingdom. And so the way the Pharisees went about practicing that is they read their Bibles religiously. And they actually cataloged every command they could find in Scripture, all 613 of them. And they preached those commands religiously, all 613 commands. The problem is that they also added some additional laws to this, which they tended to judge other people for not being able to keep it as well as they did. And they also developed some loopholes for getting around the ways that they failed to keep God's law perfectly. That's the core of what Jesus is saying when he says things like this. Verse 21, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, but I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. What Jesus is saying is that God's law applies to more than just our outward actions. In other words, what God is asking us to do is to be careful with both our thoughts and words as well. And to drive home this point, Jesus uses some pretty shocking illustrations to help us see how serious this is. And some of these things would have really hit home for the Pharisees, who had a reputation for being a bit judgmental. He says, you know what, if you call someone a fool, or if you say rocket to someone, you are guilty really of breaking the law. You're guilty of the same derogatory behavior that can lead to murder. And by the way, the word raka is an Aramaic term that means I spit on you. Right? It conveys this idea of demeaning, judgmental behavior. Jesus is saying, get this, if you speak to someone like that, you're showing that something in your heart was what leads people down the path of doing the most serious things, of actually killing someone. It's extreme, but I think we can follow his logic, right? Yeah? Of course, the thing you may be wondering, at least I am when I read this passage, is wait a second, I got that. That makes sense. But are we really in danger of hell for simply getting mad at someone? Like, is that what Jesus is saying? Because that sounds impossible. Well, I mean, the answer is yes and no. It's no in the sense that he's not talking about, the occasional flare-up of anger. He's talking about this derogatory nature, or this hateful spirit, this perpetual sense that we're always mad at everyone else that may demonstrate that there's a problem going on. That and perhaps this inability to stop being angry or to not reconcile with someone else in the faith. There's actually a couple of really important words there. Jesus talks about being angry with a brother or sister. Whenever you see that in Scripture, he's not talking about people in general, like you got mad at someone on the internet or someone who cut you off in traffic. He's talking about being angry with someone who's sitting in worship with you right now. Someone who shares your faith. Someone who is gathered around this same thing. And what he's saying is your unwillingness to forgive that person or to seek forgiveness from them, to reconcile with them, demonstrates that there is a problem. Now, of course, there are problems with that if we apply it too rigidly, because it takes both parties to reconcile, right? You can't make someone do that. You can only do your part. But that's what he's saying. If you aren't willing to do your part, if you're unwilling to forgive, it might demonstrate that something is wrong. Like maybe you don't actually know God or trust God. That's a scary thought, isn't it? That's exactly why Jesus uses some of the loaded terminology that he does. It's actually to get our attention. Jesus is not trying to get us to question our salvation, but he is trying to get us to actually live out our salvation. He's saying, do a little self-inventory. If you are marked by anger, if you are marked by an unwillingness to forgive, if you're hearing all sorts of things come out of your mouth that you wish you could take back, maybe you want to do a little checking. Jesus is so serious about this that he says this. If you realize that you need to be reconciled to someone, stop what you're doing right now and go reconcile to them. Even if what you're doing right now is worshiping God. Now, worshiping God is important, right? Yeah, obviously. But apparently it misses the point if that doesn't change the way that we show up in the world. If it doesn't affect the way that we actually interact with other people. And in fact, because God tells us that flat out that he desires mercy, not sacrifice, an act of reconciliation might actually be an act of worship because it demonstrates the heart of God. Now, if that weren't motivation enough, Jesus does say, okay, and if you aren't convinced even when I talk about like eternal consequences, let me just give you some earthly consequences. You can get taken to court for this kind of stuff. Which does reinforce the fact that he's not talking about a light dust-up or some minor misunderstanding. He's talking about a pattern. He's talking about serious, if not more sinister forms of anger, right? It's not just one argument. It is being an argumentative person. It is demonstrating this inability to show up in a way that reflects the character of God that can get you into trouble, that can have consequences both in this life and the next. Jesus says this can have consequences in this life and the next as well when he continues. Verse 27, he says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Whew. I would say Jesus is getting pretty extreme here, but he did just compare calling someone a fool to murder. Seriously though, like there is a lot packed into this, and there's a couple of introductory things that we need to recognize, and that is, first of all, Jesus is talking about all genders, even though he only talks about men. Secondly, he's talking about all sexual sin, even though adultery is technically about infidelity to a spouse. And we'll talk about infidelity to a spouse in just a moment, but we're going to specifically deal with that word on the fourth line, lustfully. That's what Jesus is talking about. Lust. And the word that he uses is a word that actually means desire, or specifically unchecked desire, which once again tells us that Jesus is talking about more than just physical action. Yeah, we should be careful what we do with our bodies, but what Jesus is saying is we should be careful where we let our hearts and minds go as well. In other words, the sin happens a little further upstream. Now, the thing is what Jesus says actually stands in pretty stark contrast to what the world says, both today and in Jesus' day. In fact, one of the things that we should be reminded of as we walk through the Sermon on the Mount is, as much as we think that, man, our culture is just off the rails today, the first century Roman Empire was pretty shocking in its decadence and its explicit forms of things, including around sexuality. That said, our culture is on a similar trajectory. I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, but our culture is a bit hypersexualized. Have you noticed this? I mean, lust is almost a lost word today. And sex is everywhere because it sells. Like, if you're going to watch an NFL game today, how many sexually explicit things will you see, right? And porn is a problem of epic proportions. I mean, right? You can pull it up anytime on your phone, anytime you want. People do it all the time. And in fact, you don't even have to be looking for it to find it. I don't know if you've noticed this, but whether it's pop-up ads or things sliding into your DM on social media, there's things that are meant to actually get you lusting and to keep you coming back for more. The world is marked by all sorts of explicit material. And what makes it really hard not to give into this is the fact that pretty much the world around us says, well, what's the big deal? Right? This is natural, right? Sexual exploration and freedom. It's natural. Don't suppress it. The thing is lust isn't neutral. Right? It actually cripples relationships and destroys trust. And for every side hustle on OnlyFans or on some street corner, someone else is being trafficked or exploited or abused for the sake of, what's natural. That's the point that Jesus is making. It's not natural and it's not neutral. Unchecked desire, out of control lust, sexual decadence, all these kind of things actually have consequences in our lives and in the lives of others. That's why Jesus suggests such drastic measures for combating lust. Now, there is obviously some hyperbole going on here. Like, the application today is not cut off your hand or gouge out your eye if you struggle with this. What Jesus is saying is take this seriously. Like, recognize that lust in your life is toxic. Like, it devalues others. It leads to the real exploitation of others. It cripples your heart. It actually rewires your brain. So take it seriously. Do whatever you have to do to fight it. Call on God to help and root it out so you might actually learn what love looks like. Now, so you know, rooting out things and calling on God and learning what love looks like, that's the underlying theme of the Sermon on the Mount. We'll keep coming back to that theme again and again today, throughout this series, including today. That's going to be one of the big applications, so spoiler alert. Call on God and invite Him into these things with you. But before we get to the application, we've got to deal with these last two statements that Jesus says. The next one, which actually kind of builds on that one, says this: "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you, it's not that simple." That's a paraphrase. You can see it on the screen there. What Jesus is not saying that there aren't legitimate reasons for divorce. Neither is he saying that divorce is always a sin. What Jesus is trying to get at is what actually marriage is designed to be. And the reason Jesus is having to speak to what marriage is designed to be is the fact that Jewish men in Jesus' day believed that they could divorce their wives for almost any reason imaginable as long as they followed proper procedure and gave them a certificate of divorce. And by the way, when I say almost any reason, I mean not just infidelity. I mean like you burned dinner, that's grounds for divorce. You don't agree with everything I say, also grounds for divorce. Now, this is in contrast to women who actually couldn't do any of that. Women actually they could not divorce their husbands for any reason. And because women in the first century world were actually dependent upon their husbands for their livelihood, they couldn't work, they were in financial jeopardy if they were divorced, most women had to go along with this because it wasn't safe if this marriage ended in divorce. What Jesus is saying is, hey, look, this is not the way this is designed to work. This is not what God intended for marriage. Marriage is not supposed to be what you get out of it. It's actually supposed to be what you give in it. In fact, this is why Scripture so often uses marriage as an illustration, as a picture of what our relationship with God is like. God, who loves us faithfully, and who serves us sacrificially through Jesus, and who seals us to himself eternally by his Spirit. That's the picture we're supposed to look at. That God won't give up on us. He won't get tired of us. He won't trade us in for a younger model. He actually is committed to us through all things. The teaching of Scripture, and I'd say what's behind this passage, is this call to say our marriages here should reflect God's love. Like we actually, if we're going to commit ourselves to someone, should be faithful like that until the end. Again, he's not saying that there aren't legitimate reasons for divorce at times. He's just saying anything less than that, any kind of flippant attitude towards marriage actually can do harm in the world. To you, to your spouse, or to anyone who remarries you or your spouse if you separate. Now, of course, here's the thing about this idea of divorce and marriage. It's such a complicated and nuanced situation, and there are a million different scenarios that could be discussed. In fact, we could spend the whole day talking about how messy this can be. But for the sake of time, I just want to give you some principles that might help us understand how this can apply. I think first and foremost, what Jesus is saying is like our marriages should reflect the love of God, which means God should actually be at the center of our marriages. If that's the case, it reduces the chance, doesn't necessarily eliminate it, but it reduces the chance that our marriages end in divorce. Secondly, he's not saying that there aren't legitimate reasons for divorce. There is a reason why this is permitted, which means you don't have to stay in a bad marriage. Right? I mean, you can if you think there's a path towards redemption, but you don't have to. There are grounds for divorce. Jesus specifically calls out infidelity. I would add things like abuse or abandonment. There are legitimate reasons you don't have to stay. You also don't have to get remarried if it ends. You can honor God in your newfound singleness. You can honor God in lifelong singleness. Thirdly, if you think, I'm in trouble because I got divorced and remarried for the wrong reasons, don't think two wrongs make a right. If you're in a new marriage, you don't need to end that to rectify things. Honor God where you are now. Seek forgiveness for the past, and perhaps apply the first thing that Jesus says in this passage. If you need to reconcile to someone, your ex, who is a brother and sister in the faith, do what you can to pursue that. Fourthly, and I think this is the most important thing that I would hope you hear in this section, whatever your marital status is, if you're single or married or divorced or remarried or widowed, wherever you are, know this, there's room for you in the church. I think the church has misunderstood this passage for many years. And I think what we need to be reminded of is God doesn't give up on us, and He doesn't judge us for our past. He actually sets us free. The church should follow suit. Two wrongs don't make a right. Let's treat each other right, even as we point each other towards the truth. Speaking of truth, the final statement in this section is in verse 33. Jesus says, "You have heard it said, do not break an oath, but I say to you, do not make an oath." Once again, a paraphrase. No, it's not that oaths are a bad thing. It's that not telling the truth is. It's not that making promises is wrong, it's that breaking our promises is a bad thing. And that's really the heart of what Jesus is getting at. That when we find ways out of keeping the truth, when we look for loopholes to justify ourselves, that's when we're in trouble. And Jesus is specifically, I think, calling out groups like the Pharisees who were known for doing this. It's not exactly as clear in Matthew's gospel as it is in Luke's gospel, where we find similar teaching. But there's a specific part where he says, people were saying, oh, I know I swore by the temple, but I didn't mean it because I didn't swear by the gold in the temple. This way's around keeping your word. Jesus is saying that's not the way it's supposed to be. What he's saying is live so faithfully and honestly and truthfully that you don't have to make promises. When you say yes, people know they can count on it. When you say no, they know what you mean. Now, that doesn't just happen overnight. It takes a lifetime to build a reputation like that. And that's actually what Jesus is saying. Like, spend your life, live your life like this. Let your life reflect my life, not that of the evil one, who's also called the father of lies in Scripture. In other words, this is worth the effort. Live so faithfully that people take you at your word. Okay, that's the 4 statements today. If you've heard it said, but I say to you. Again, there are 2 more that we'll look at next week. And if you think these are hard to apply, come back next week. But seriously, these here speak to the heart of God's law. And they speak to this way of life that actually still applies, even as Jesus broadens the application of this. Of course, here's something that I said earlier. There is misunderstanding about what it means to follow God's law. We just looked at the misunderstanding in Jesus' day. I think we need to take a brief moment to contend with the misunderstanding today. Specifically, this idea that I think many of us Christians have of saying, well, this law doesn't really apply anymore because Jesus died for my sins. True. Maybe this feels like the opposite of religion, because didn't Jesus set us free? Yes, Jesus set us free, but not from the heart of God's law. In fact, I would dare say that I think probably one of the greatest challenges for followers of Jesus in the 21st century Western world, particularly in places like the United States of America, which celebrates freedom, maybe sometimes some slight misunderstanding of freedom, is this feels like it flies in the face of what we're all about, right? Like, isn't this about a relationship and not a religion, not rules? Yes. But here's the thing. Our problem is not just as Americans, it's as human beings who are still vulnerable to the father of lies. In other words, I think what happens is we have a misunderstanding today that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve were led astray by a serpent, which may have been an anaconda, probably not. Serpent nonetheless. It's this idea that freedom is being able to be our own gods, to make our own decisions, to be able to be free of any rules, to be able to do whatever I want. Oh, but friends, that's actually a distortion, a misunderstanding of what freedom actually is. Freedom isn't the absence of rules. It isn't the ability to do whatever I want. It's actually the ability to flourish under the right set of circumstances. It's actually to live the way that we are designed to live. And I tell you what, to help you see this, let's pull in some modern day illustration, like fish. Fish. When we take them out of the ocean, we put them in fish tanks, which is really restrictive when you think about it, right? Well, why not set fish free? Why not take them out of the tank? Well, because Finding Nemo taught us that fish don't do so well when they're taken out of the tank. And yes, they do best when they're in the ocean, but just bear with me. Or think about a train, right? Trains are restricted by rails. Why not take the train off the rails, right? If you do, in some sense, the train is freer than ever. But guess what? It's not going anywhere. Especially if you try to move it across a muddy field or a sandy beach. It's the rails that actually allow a train to be a train. Or how about this? since that's brought up in today's passage, and since this is actually this great picture that Scripture gives us of what it looks like to be in relationship with God, marriage. There are no rules for marriage exactly, but there are some vows, aren't there? Those vows are like, hey, I'm going to actually care for this other person. And oh, by the way, not date other people. Is that restrictive? Yeah. But you know what happens when you don't keep those vows? We've already talked about it. Jesus talked about divorce. What I'm getting at is maybe we have a misunderstanding of what it means to be free. And maybe the things that Jesus is calling us to in this passage, even though it is incredibly hard and incredibly restrictive in many ways, this might actually be the most freeing way there is to live. In fact, this might be the most life-giving advice that anyone has ever given us. In fact, imagine if we actually applied the things that Jesus is talking about. Can you imagine what it would be like to live in a world where you're free of racial slurs and road rage and reckless words? Can you imagine not having to worry about being taken advantage of or cheated on? Can you imagine a world without broken homes or broken promises? Can you imagine if people actually cared for each other deeply and the neighborhoods that we belong to and the planet that we live on? Can you imagine showing up for worship without the baggage of broken relationships or wandering eyes or words that we wish we could take back? Doesn't that sound liberating? It does to me. It sounds incredibly hard, and it doesn't sound like something that's just going to happen automatically, but it sounds like something that Jesus says can happen when we follow His commands. And we submit to the will of God with the help of the Spirit of God. That's the invitation, friends. Not a new set of rules, again, that are harder than the old ones, but something that's lived according to the heart of God, with the help of God. You've heard it said? Jesus says, let me show you what that means. Follow me and be free. May it be so.